Howdy, folks. Thought I would talk today about anger. I have several pages of notes that I'm going to work my way through. This is my anecdotal experience of anger, and I'm going to talk about it as it is involved in my experience with PTSD from wartime trauma, complex PTSD from childhood, and as I am beginning to understand, it applies to autism. Why is this relevant? Anger is a very common experience. Specifically, troubles with anger are a keynote of many veterans' experience with PTSD, combat stress, or moral injury. Anger is also pretty common in other experiences of mental health difficulties. Now, anger is a natural defense mechanism used to establish boundaries, to protect us, to keep us safe. It's a very powerful emotion. There is even some research that anger is sub-emotion, and it's a mechanism that gets engaged before we know what we're feeling. Seems to be that it can be accessed without thinking about it, and that your adrenals and your actions engage, and then you're aware of the feeling of anger. And this checks out with my experience of anger. Anger would kick in and I would get thrown into the fire room well before I knew what was happening. More noise from the road. What I can say from experience is because anger activates your adrenals, it's very taxing on the body. My guess is that's because it evolved for limited short-term use to simply, in a crisis situation, establish a boundary to keep us safe. It wasn't meant for long-term use. So why is anger such a big thing for me? Well, I learned it as an appropriate response when I was very young. No surprise for a lot of Gen Xers. My dad is a Vietnam veteran who experienced the horrors of war. He has undiagnosed PTSD, my statement. There's a lot that goes into that. Not the least of which is there were no services for mental health where I grew up. And what I remember from very, very young, it's changed now as he's gotten older, but when I was very young, he got angry about everything. That was his response to everything. And on top of that, I wasn't allowed to express emotions because that stressed him out and would set off his anger response. I was trained to not show any emotion, even joy or happiness or just, kid goofing off stuff. I had to just stone face, be good, be on my best behavior. What I learned from that, and phrases like, well, you're not the dad, is that it would be okay for me to be angry when I got older. A compounding factor in me learning anger was autism. Struggled with emotional communication, normal emotional communication. And at that very young age, I'm learning proper behavior by imitation. And take things very literally. So again, learning anger because that's what I was presented with. And then as a teenager, I remember being told by my dad quite a bit, don't get angry. Why are you getting angry? You shouldn't be angry all the time. And that feedback was very confusing. Well, but that's what you do, and you've never apologized for it or said you were wrong, so that makes it right. What I took from that is I'm still not old enough to be angry yet. It's not appropriate for me, but it will be someday because that's the thing Dad taught me, and he's older than me. Naturally, as I left home and started to engage with the rest of the world, when I would try out anger, I got pushback. Surprise, surprise. That was very confusing for me. That's what I had learned. Very occasionally, someone would explain the situation to me and why anger was the inappropriate response. And they would take pains to be very specific about it and be very gentle with me. And that helped tremendously, especially the very detailed explanation of why this wasn't appropriate for the situation, that helped my autistic self say, oh, okay, this is what I need to do instead, and learn some proper behavior. And then, with the help of alcohol, I learned to access kind of the spectrum of emotions other than anger. The unsaid thing here that you're hearing is all you learned was anger as an emotion. What I learned was anger was the proper emotion, and it kind of tamped down the rest of it for a lot of years, and then was able to access it again, including humor, sadness, joy, sarcasm, all the other things. And then I moved into adult life, and over time I noticed a couple of disturbing patterns. The first one was I was very comfortable around angry people. Very comfortable. It might sound weird to you, but I felt at home around someone who was losing their mind with anger. That's really not a healthy way to be comfortable around aggression, but I'm pretty strong, and so I stayed safe through that and luck. Over time, I noticed that my calmness in anger situations usually helped diffuse things because the angry person wasn't having an effect on me, and the people around me saw me as calm and confident, and it helped things. But I also noticed that other people experiencing the anger thought it was really weird that I was so calm in an aggressive situation. Another disturbing pattern was that any adversaries I had, usually within a short period of time, would figure out that they could get me angry and then get their way or what they wanted, or get me out of the picture. And that really frustrated me, obviously. It also confused me because I was still under the impression that anger was a proper emotion to show, and now I was old enough to show it, and that it was to be respected. Anger was to be respected. And another pattern that I noticed was that I began to think of everyone else around me as undisciplined or lazy, and that's why they weren't angry about this situation. They just didn't care enough, and I cared greatly. Anger was definitely the hallmark of how much I cared. My anger reached its peak after I came back from wartime service. And honestly, the first thing I felt when I came back from war was nothing. This was somewhat familiar from my childhood of having to suppress all my emotions. The difference was I wasn't actively suppressing them, they just weren't there. And then, after that period of nothing, the PTSD, the combat stress, the moral injury hit. You can guess the first emotion that came back. Anger. Of course. And I got angry at and about everything. And I've talked about those stories and experiences in other places, notably in the series my wife did about being a caregiver for someone with PTSD. But my anger got so bad that I started to describe it as being thrown into the fire room. The reason I said it that way is it was out of my control. It would happen, and there was nothing I could do about it. It drove family and friends away, predictably, and it caused me employment problems and road rage problems, all the things you read about, and anger even drove me to self-harm. Because pain, experiencing a sharp enough or an intense enough pain would kick me out of my anger experience, and I didn't want to be angry. And it's a terrible place to be where hurting yourself is the only thing that stops the anger. So this is obviously a tangled mess. As relates to PTSD and activation of fight or flight, the fear of someone going to get you from behind, anger keeps you safe. And so I think you default to it quite a bit. As relates to complex PTSD, there's a generational pattern of anger in my family, from my grandpa to my dad to me. I think that's pretty common. And then with autism, you have expected patterns of meltdown and burnout, and anger was the emotion I used to deal with that. So as my adult life progressed, my health deteriorated. Not just my mental health, but also my physical health. We're talking weight gain, we're talking high blood pressure, we're talking chronic pain. The after effects of getting angry feel like I have run a marathon. All of my systems are spent and I feel absolutely gutted. If a marathon's not familiar to you, it feels like I've spent 12 hours bucking bales in the hayfield. Or I just spent 16 hours in Mop 4. Or I just played back-to-back-to-back sporting events at a tournament where we seemingly had to play every match every time for 12 hours a day. Or any other number of completely draining experiences. Life got really dark. It took a suicide scare in 2017 to snap me out of my downward trajectory. And I've talked about that journey in another series of videos on this channel called my PTSD Journey. Among all the symptoms of health and mental health that I've had to work on over the last 7 years, anger has been the hardest and longest running work I've had to do. Anger has been the most troubling symptom I have had. It's taken a lot of different varied work to improve it. Things like talk therapy and EMDR and anger management classes, prayer, diet, hydration, medications, doing my own research on what could possibly work to help improve my anger, self-awareness, cultivating that, and time to get it to stick, because I spent my entire youth learning that anger was my tool. When it comes to getting rid of anger, you name it, I've probably tried it. That's not a statement about how ineffective those things are. That's a statement of, I had a big anger problem. And each one of those little things was a step and a piece and improvement along the way that got me to where I am. Anger's not gone, but it is orders of magnitude better than it ever has been in my life. So does any of this sound familiar to you in your experience in life? It's not unexpected, especially if you have things like wartime experience, or you've got PTSD from a traumatic event, or you've got childhood stuff going on. If I've heard the term autistic rage, that's a colloquialism, I think. That's not a scientific term, but anger seems to be pretty present wherever people have repeated, long-standing, unresolved difficulty. Now, it's not easy, but you can improve your experience of anger and improve your symptoms of anger. You can get less angry. And I mean real improvement, not just suppressing it or tamping it down or creating other problems in your life, but actual resolution of the symptom of anger. So if you have any questions about my experience of anger, if you've got any stories you want to share, hit me up in the comments. I will definitely listen. I'm probably not going to have answers for you, but I will at least pray for you. And also, if you have any anger resources you want to share, put those in the comments too. I am always open to new ways of combating anger, of healing anger. And that goes for any wisdom you have about anger. Put that in the comments too. Folks, thank you. I wish you peace. And remember, hope is a choice. I've got a microphone coming, so hopefully that'll help with the gain of the sound. Until then, thanks for being patient.